Imagine a packed arena in Las Vegas, mid-70s. Thousands of fans on their feet, the air trembling with anticipation, the spotlights blazing down on a white jumpsuit stitched with gold. Elvis Presley strides onto the stage, every eye fixed on him, when suddenly, in the shadows at the edge of the spotlight, a police officer steps forward. His face is ice, his hand raised to halt the music. "If he keeps moving like that," the officer hisses to a promoter, "I'll arrest him right here." Elvis sees it. He feels the threat pressing against the stage like a cold blade. But instead of shrinking back, he moves closer to the microphone. The orchestra falters, the room holding its breath. His voice cuts through the silence, sharp, unflinching, impossible to ignore. The audience freezes. You could slice the tension in the air with a knife. No one knows what will happen next. Will the police drag him away in front of thousands? Or will the king of rock and roll turn the threat into something no badge can contain? That night would not only test a man, it would test the very idea of freedom on stage. And what happened next would be remembered far beyond Las Vegas. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. Las Vegas in the early 1970s was a city wrapped in light, but beneath the glitter, it was a place of constant tension. The Hilton Hotel towered above the Strip, its neon sign glowing like a beacon in the desert night. Inside, gamblers fed coins into slot machines that chimed endlessly, while tuxedoed waiters slid through the smoke-filled rooms, balancing trays of champagne and bourbon. The entire city pulsed with indulgence, but in those days there was also a current of fear. Behind the glamour, conservative forces, politicians, sheriffs, even certain businessmen, watched with suspicion as popular culture bent further away from their control. No one embodied that cultural clash more than Elvis Presley. To his fans, he was freedom personified, a man who could take a stage and make the whole room feel alive. But to his critics, he remained the same dangerous figure they had tried to silence in the 1950s. They hadn't forgotten the outcry over his swiveling hips on national television, or the accusations of indecency hurled at him when he was barely more than a boy from Tupelo. 2 decades later, their resentment had not faded. If anything, it had hardened. As 1972 rolled into 1973, the Hilton became the center of his performing life. The casino's main showroom held nearly 2,000 people, every table draped in white linen, every chair filled with someone eager to see the king in person. Tickets sold out weeks in advance. Women in sequined gowns clutched handbags with trembling hands. Men loosened their ties as soon as the lights dimmed. And somewhere in the crowd every night sat reporters and columnists, ready to shape public opinion with a single article. A week before one particular concert, the atmosphere around Presley's residency shifted. A warning came down quietly but firmly from the office of the Clark County Sheriff. If Presley engaged in indecent movements on stage, the police reserved the right to halt the performance. The language was vague, but everyone in his camp understood the meaning. Too much hip motion, too much suggestion, and the show could be interrupted. The note was delivered to the Hilton's promoters, who in turn passed it to Colonel Tom Parker, Presley's famously shrewd manager. The colonel read it twice, then folded it into his pocket as if trying to make it disappear. But news in Las Vegas never stayed hidden for long. Within days, a local newspaper ran a column. "Presley persists in corrupting the young." The phrasing was antiquated, but the impact was immediate. Some readers scoffed, others fumed, but Elvis's most devoted fans felt personally attacked. Letters poured into the Hilton, some defending him, others demanding he keep it clean. Inside Presley's own circle, The mood fractured. Musicians, bodyguards, and friends debated in hushed tones between rehearsals. One camp urged caution. Play the songs. Keep the movements small. Finish the season without trouble. Another camp pressed the opposite. Be yourself. Give the audience the Elvis they came for. The man who broke the rules and made history. The arguments were sharp, voices rising, hands gesturing in frustration. Through it all, Elvis remained largely silent. He spent more time alone in his suite on the upper floors of the Hilton, staring out at the endless sprawl of lights across the desert. The suite was grand. Velvet drapes, thick carpets, a piano near the window. But he treated it more like a cell than a palace. He'd pace the room, smoke curling above his head, guitar sometimes resting in his lap without a sound leaving it. To those who knew him best, his silence spoke volumes. It wasn't fear they saw in his eyes, but a storm of conflict. The urge to give the crowd everything, and the weight of knowing that doing so could bring the police to his very stage. Meanwhile, the city around him pulsed on. Roulette wheels spun, dice clattered across green felt, showgirls rehearsed their choreography with feathers and sequins flashing under stage lights. Tourists in Hawaiian shirts stumbled out of neon-lit lounges, clutching half-finished cocktails. Vegas was a place of abandon, yet its lawmen were suddenly poised to draw a line against the very performer who embodied that spirit. The night before the concert, tension rippled through the Hilton like an unspoken secret. Security staff whispered about plainclothes officers who might be in the crowd. The colonel walked the backstage corridors with his cigar clenched tighter than usual, muttering about headlines and contracts. A few of the band members kept their jokes going, trying to mask their unease, but their laughter sounded thinner than it had in years past. And outside the hotel, fans lined up early, some clutching posters, others carrying flowers. To them, Elvis was not just an entertainer. He was proof that someone could rise from poverty, from obscurity, and shake the world. They came to feel that proof in person, to watch him command a stage with a presence unlike anyone else. They didn't know about the sheriff's warning or the threats hanging over the show, but they would soon feel it. By the time the sun fell and the strip exploded into neon brilliance, the city seemed to hold its breath. Police cruisers lingered longer than usual outside the Hilton, their red lights flickering in silence. Inside, the room filled until every chair was claimed, the air heavy with perfume, smoke, and anticipation. Behind the curtain, Elvis adjusted his white jumpsuit embroidered with golden details, took a breath, and prepared to step into a storm far greater than he had anticipated. He had faced controversy before. He had been mocked, dismissed, even censored. But that night in Las Vegas was not just about a man on stage. It was about whether music itself could be policed, whether freedom of expression could be bound by a badge. And as the first notes of the orchestra began to rise, every person in the Hilton, fan, officer, promoter, and singer, knew they were about to witness something unforgettable. The house lights dimmed, and a low murmur rippled across the vast Hilton showroom like the stirring of an ocean tide. The orchestra's brass flared, sharp and triumphant, and the curtains parted to reveal the silhouette the crowd had been waiting for. When Elvis Presley stepped into the glow, the room erupted. Women screamed. Some cried outright, hands clutching at their companions as if they might faint from the sheer force of his presence. Men clapped hard against the tables, slamming rings against glass tumblers, adding to the storm of sound. He was dressed in white, a suit glimmering under the stage lights, decorated with gold embroidery that caught every flicker of brightness. His hair shone like obsidian under the spotlight, and his face, at once youthful and lined with the weight of years, lit with a smile that both reassured and provoked. To the audience, he was unbreakable, larger than life. Only a handful of people in that room knew the shadows pressing at the edges of his triumph. From the first note of C.C. Rider, the hall vibrated. The horns blared, the drums pounded, and Elvis moved with a rhythm that seemed to pull the audience's hearts forward. The crowd rose to its feet, arms stretched out toward him. For many, just being in that room meant crossing state lines, saving paychecks, begging for a ticket. To breathe the same air as him felt like entering history. But not every pair of eyes in the audience gleamed with awe. Near the front rows, several men sat stiff in their chairs, hands folded, their gazes cold. Uniforms were absent, but the straight-backed posture and clipped haircuts gave them away. Off-duty police, seated close enough to scrutinize every gesture. Behind them, against the walls, stood others, security or plainclothes lawmen, faces expressionless, scanning the stage for something they could call an offense. When Elvis launched into Polk Salad Annie, the energy in the hall reached a fever pitch. That song, with its swampy rhythm and playful lyrics, had always been an excuse for him to let loose. He kicked his legs, bent his knees, and let his hips drive the beat as the audience screamed in delight. To his fans, this was the essence of Presley. The body language that once shocked America into realizing music could be sensual, rebellious, alive. But to the men watching with folded arms, it was evidence. They leaned toward one another, whispering sharp remarks that cut through the roar of applause. One of them, a stocky officer with a jaw set like stone, stood abruptly and walked with purpose toward the edge of the stage. His shoes clicked against the showroom floor, audible even beneath the music. He leaned close to Colonel Parker, who was stationed near the side curtain with his cigar smoldering. "Another move like that, and he's done," the officer muttered, his voice clipped, stripped of courtesy. "We'll pull him down from there." The colonel's eyes narrowed, but his smile remained fixed. He said nothing, only nodded once as if acknowledging a game he had no choice but to play. He turned back toward the stage, puffing his cigar more furiously, sweat glistening on his brow despite the coolness of the air-conditioned room. On stage, Elvis noticed the exchange. For a moment, his eyes darted to the side, reading the tension written across his manager's face. He caught the stance of the officer, the threat simmering there, and his own chest tightened. But to the audience, there was no hesitation. He whipped the microphone cord, grinned mischievously, and dipped low to the floor as the crowd's screams rose higher. The reaction was immediate. A group of women near the front collapsed into each other, shrieking his name. Men slapped the tablecloths as if egging him on. It was as though the entire showroom was electrified by a single current, surging outward from his movements. Every gesture drew them further into a world where rules didn't matter, where freedom was alive in a body's motion and a voice's thunder. Yet just beyond the edge of the spotlight, that world trembled. The officers had begun to whisper again, more urgently. Their expressions shifted from irritation to determination. They didn't see art or joy. They saw disobedience. To them, he was mocking authority, flaunting it in front of 2,000 witnesses. For the musicians, the tension was palpable. Behind their instruments, they caught glimpses of the stern men at the stage's edge, the gestures exchanged with Parker, the hush of orders spreading in the shadows. Some faltered slightly in their playing, barely perceptible, but enough for Elvis to notice. His sharp ear caught the hesitation, and his mind snapped to the cause. Inside him, a storm brewed. He had lived years under the watchful eyes of authority, from his draft into the army to the criticism hurled at his every performance. Tonight, that weight pressed against him once again, but he refused to let it show. His jaw set, his smile widened, and he flung his arm across the crowd as if daring the entire city to challenge him. The song ended in a crescendo of drums and brass, the last note echoing like a shout across the room. The audience exploded to their feet, applause pounding the walls, voices straining against the ceiling. Yet in that thunder, Elvis felt the chill of the officers' glares. He could almost taste their resolve, the way a storm announces itself in the air before lightning strikes. The crowd thought they were watching a concert. They did not yet realize they were watching a battle take form, a clash not just between a singer and authority, but between freedom and control, between joy and judgment. And Elvis, standing tall beneath the blinding lights, understood more than anyone that the night was just beginning. The midway point of the concert arrived with the weight of inevitability. The air in the Hilton showroom had grown thick, not only from the haze of cigarette smoke, but from the clash of two opposing forces, the ecstatic devotion of the audience and the quiet, iron determination of the officers who lurked near the stage. Elvis had just finished another number, sweat glistening along his temples, his chest rising and falling with the exertion. He reached for a towel, dabbed his face, and flashed that half-smile that had driven millions wild since the 1950s. The band waited for his cue, poised to begin the next song, when the first rupture in the night occurred. One of the officers, tall, broad-shouldered, his expression unreadable, stepped away from the wall and walked directly toward the foot of the stage. His movements were deliberate, steady, as though he wanted the whole room to see. He lifted a hand and made a sharp motion, signaling toward the orchestra pit. The meaning was clear. Stop. Some of the musicians froze mid-preparation, horns half-raised, sticks hovering above drums. A ripple of confusion ran across their faces. The audience noticed almost instantly. At first, it was just a subtle murmur. A question passed from one table to another. But within seconds the unease spread, and the sound shifted from applause to bewildered chatter. A woman near the front clutched her husband's arm, eyes wide. A group of young men in the back shouted, demanding the show continue. The mood, which moments earlier had been euphoric, began to tilt toward chaos. Elvis sensed it instantly. He had been on stages his entire life, and he knew the difference between noise made for him and noise made against something else. He turned slightly, watching the officer who now stood less than 20 feet from him. Their eyes locked. The officer's face carried no warmth, only duty. It was the look of a man who believed he was enforcing order, even as he risked igniting disorder. The music faltered. A trumpet slid into silence, and the drummer's hands lowered. The audience gasped, voices rising. Some booed, some shouted questions, while others sat in stunned quiet, realizing they were witnessing something raw and unscripted. Elvis stepped back from the microphone stand. For a heartbeat, he simply looked out across the sea of faces, letting the noise wash over him. His chest tightened, and for the first time that night, he allowed himself to acknowledge the threat looming over the performance. He could feel the weight of every camera flash, every stare, every whisper. He inhaled, long and deliberate, then returned to the mic. His voice cut through the noise, colder than the air conditioning, sharper than the brass that had just fallen silent. If you think you can silence me for moving my legs, then you'll have to silence everyone in this room, because we all came here to be free. The words struck the room like a lightning bolt. Instantly, silence. Even the hum of the ceiling fans seemed suddenly too loud. Thousands of people froze, as if time itself had stilled. A glass clinked against a table and sounded like a hammer blow in the stillness. Faces across the audience revealed a spectrum of emotion. Some were pale with fear, eyes darting toward the police at the stage edge. Others glowed with awe, mouths open, unable to believe they were hearing such defiance. Tears welled in the eyes of more than a few, as if the statement had unshackled something inside them. The officer at the foot of the stage, who only moments earlier had looked unshakable, blinked. His jaw tightened. The hand at his side flexed once, betraying the briefest crack in his composure. For a second, even he seemed unsure. Elvis remained still, his hands gripping the microphone, his posture unwavering. He didn't smile, didn't soften the blow of his words with charm. He let them hang in the air, heavy as lead, daring anyone to move against them. Somewhere near the back, a man began to clap, slow, deliberate. Then another. Within moments, the silence fractured into applause, then into a roar of approval. The room ignited with sound once again, but this time it was not just adoration of a performer, it was solidarity, a collective declaration that they stood with him. Yet beneath that roar, tension did not vanish. It shifted. The officers exchanged looks, grim and calculating. They had expected compliance, or at least retreat. Instead, they had been challenged, not just by one man, but by an entire crowd that now seemed willing to resist. The colonel stood at the side of the stage, sweat soaking through his collar, watching with a mix of awe and terror. He knew the danger. He had always played Elvis's image like a hand of cards, balancing risk with reward. But tonight, the stakes were no longer just publicity or contracts. Tonight, it was law against spirit, authority against freedom. Elvis's heart pounded, but outwardly he was calm. He turned his head slightly, caught the eyes of his band, and with a subtle nod, he urged them back to readiness. The musicians, though shaken, straightened their backs and lifted their instruments once more. But the audience, even in their cheers, seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Would the police advance? Would the music be cut off entirely? The uncertainty hung over every table like a storm cloud about to break. And at the center of it all stood Elvis Presley, defiant, unbending, his voice still echoing in their ears. He had spoken not just for himself, but for every soul in that room. And the officers, for all their authority, now faced a truth that shook them. They were not only confronting a man, they were confronting the will of thousands. The next note had yet to be played, but already the night had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The silence that had gripped the Hilton showroom shattered into a storm. Elvis's defiant words still lingered in the air, but now the audience erupted in a frenzy that even he could not have fully anticipated. Thousands of voices rose at once, some shouting encouragement, others crying out in alarm. People surged to their feet, napkins and programs fluttering to the ground, tables shaking as glasses tipped and rolled. What had begun as a concert now resembled a rally or a battlefield. The energy had transformed, raw and uncontainable. From the back rows came the cries of loyalty. "We love you, Elvis! Don't let them stop you!" Women clapped furiously, their rings catching the stage lights, while men bellowed as if at a prize fight. Yet there were others, more cautious, more fearful, who tugged at their companions' sleeves, urging them to sit, whispering about the danger of provoking the police. Some covered their mouths, stunned into silence, unable to comprehend how a night of music had become a confrontation with authority. At the foot of the stage, the officer who had signaled the band earlier took a deliberate step forward. The leather of his shoes creaked as he moved, and the action itself sent a ripple through the crowd. The audience responded instantly, a wave of resistance rising from the floor. Men and women alike leaned toward the stage, fists clenched, bodies pressed closer. Some began moving up the aisles, as though preparing to stand between the police and the singer they adored. The atmosphere was one spark away from igniting. The officers saw it too. Their rigid discipline faltered for an instant, their eyes darting between the stage and the restless crowd. They were armed with authority, yes, but here in this glittering hall they were outnumbered 1,000 to 1. And the energy of a mob, once unleashed, could sweep through the Hilton like a desert wildfire. In the midst of it, Elvis raised his hand. Not with flourish, not with theatricality, just a steady, commanding gesture. The effect was immediate. The screams dimmed, the stomping slowed, and a hush returned. Though this time it was not silence born of fear. It was silence born of obedience. He had their attention, every soul in that room waiting for the next word. He leaned slightly toward the microphone, his voice resonant yet calm, the very tone that had soothed millions through radios and televisions for nearly 2 decades. Nobody fights tonight. Music is not a crime. The words rippled outward, simple yet devastatingly powerful. The roar of chaos sank into stillness, like a wave collapsing back into the sea. People stopped in their tracks, lowering clenched fists, easing their shoulders. The audience, who moments earlier looked ready to clash with officers, now stood frozen, bound not by fear of the police, but by the authority of the man they had come to see. The officers were caught in a paradox. They had intended to control the room, to impose order on a spectacle they considered dangerous. Yet it was Elvis, not their presence, not their threats, who had tamed the crowd. The realization unsettled them. One of the men shifted his weight uneasily, his fingers drumming against his belt, his jaw tightening with frustration. From the stage, Elvis's gaze swept across the hall. He saw the tear-streaked faces of women who had cried out for him seconds earlier. He saw men who had risen in anger now standing awkwardly, their fists loosening at their sides. And he saw the police, stone-faced, but no longer in command. For the first time that night, he understood the depth of his influence. He wasn't just performing songs. He was holding the balance of power between authority and freedom. His words echoed inside the minds of those present. Music is not a crime. A statement so plain it could have been overlooked. Yet in that moment, it carried the weight of Scripture. The audience, still silent, began to react. Not with noise, but with posture. They leaned forward, eyes locked on him, breaths shallow. He had them entirely, every person waiting for the next note or phrase. It was as though the Hilton showroom had become a cathedral, and Presley, its unexpected preacher. The officer closest to the stage stood frozen, his plan derailed by the shift in atmosphere. He had expected chaos, resistance, maybe even violence, anything that would justify action. Instead, the singer had drained the room of fury with a single sentence. The officer's confidence faltered. His jaw clenched, his shoulders stiffened, but a shadow of doubt crossed his eyes. The colonel, lurking in the wings, wiped his brow with a handkerchief, astonished by what had just unfolded. He had long known Elvis could command a stage, but this was something altogether different. It wasn't entertainment, it was authority. And Parker, for all his scheming, realized that not even his own strategies had created this moment. It was Elvis, alone. Elvis stood still for another beat, then gave the slightest nod to the band. The musicians, reassured by the steadiness in his face, prepared to play again. The audience waited, hushed yet trembling with energy. It was clear to all of them that the concert had shifted beyond music, beyond spectacle. It had become a confrontation in which every gesture, every phrase, carried the weight of history. As the next song began, softer and slower, the Hilton showroom seemed to exhale. Yet under the calm surface, the stakes had only risen higher. The police had not withdrawn. The threat remained, hovering like a blade above the stage. And though Elvis had quelled the storm for now, both he and everyone present knew the night had reached a place where anything could happen. Behind the curtain, the atmosphere had curdled into something nearly unbearable. The Hilton's backstage corridor, usually filled with laughter, cigarette smoke, and the loose chatter of musicians, had become a pressure chamber. Colonel Parker paced like a caged animal, his cigar clamped between his fingers, ash spilling carelessly onto the carpet. His wide-brimmed hat was pushed back, sweat shining at his temples. He had spent years manipulating contracts, politicians, and promoters, but the faces of the police officers confronting him now were not negotiable showmen. They were men of the law, convinced of their right to shut everything down. "You don't want this to blow up," Parker hissed, his accent sharp, his words clipped. "This isn't just some singer on a stage. This is money. This is tourism. This is your city's reputation. If you drag him off, you'll be on the front page of every paper in the country tomorrow." The officer he addressed, a captain in his 40s with eyes as hard as glass, didn't flinch. His badge glinted under the dim backstage lights as he replied, "The order is clear. If Presley doesn't stop this indecency, the concert ends. That's not a request. That's the law." Tension tightened the air like wire pulled to breaking point. A pair of musicians who had slipped off stage for water stood frozen, holding their paper cups mid-air, listening to the exchange. One of the bodyguards shifted his weight, placing himself closer to Elvis's dressing room door, aware that trouble was no longer hypothetical. Out on stage, the orchestra played softly, filling the silence with careful notes, while Elvis stood in near stillness, buying time. His presence remained calm, but his ear caught enough from backstage to understand the ultimatum being handed down. He knew what Parker was trying to argue, knew the danger of letting the police dictate the end of the night. And yet, instead of caving, his instinct pushed him in the opposite direction. He stepped back to the microphone, his body upright, shoulders squared. Without introduction, without explanation, he began to sing a song that had not been planned for the set list. His voice rose, unaccompanied at first, clear and resonant enough to fill the cavernous room. "If I can dream of a better land, where all my brothers walk hand in hand." The musicians froze, stunned, then slowly began to fall in behind him. A few strings, a gentle chord from the piano, then the full swell of accompaniment as the audience realized what they were hearing. "If I Can Dream," the ballad he had sung in 1968, born of the unrest and sorrow of a nation struggling with assassinations and civil rights battles. A song that wasn't just entertainment, but prayer, plea, and protest. The Hilton showroom went silent, except for his voice. Forks paused midway to plates, glasses stopped at lips, cigarettes burned down unattended. Every word he sang carried more than melody. It carried defiance. He wasn't asking permission to finish the show. He was reminding everyone why he was there at all. Backstage, the officers stood still. The captain's hand hovered near his belt, but he did not move. He listened, as much against his will as by choice. For all their authority, none of them had expected this man to meet their threat not with retreat, but with music itself. Elvis's voice swelled, thick with emotion. There must be peace and understanding sometime. The crowd leaned forward, as though drawn by an invisible force. Tears welled in the eyes of women and men alike. Some clasped their hands as though in prayer. The song, written years earlier for a television special, now rang with new weight. It wasn't a broadcast, it was a standoff, and his song became both shield and sword. By the time he reached the climax, his voice cracking with passion, the tension in the hall had transformed. The officers no longer looked like men in control, but like statues trapped in the wrong place. The audience was utterly his, and the Hilton showroom had turned sacred. For those backstage, the contrast was jarring. Parker argued in whispers with the captain, trying to keep negotiations alive, while the sound of Elvis's voice rolled over them like thunder. The band, once anxious, now played with fire, as though they too understood the stakes. And Presley himself stood in the white-hot center, commanding not with fists or shouts, but with song. When the last note faded, the silence was vast and reverent. Then came the applause, louder, more furious than anything yet that night. People stood on chairs, clapping until their palms stung, shouting his name over and over. Some wept openly, overcome by the gravity of the moment. The police officers exchanged looks, their earlier certainty fractured. They had walked in intending to end a concert. Now they were caught in something larger, a tide they could not control. The captain's face remained stern, but doubt had carved its way into his eyes. Elvis bowed his head slightly, letting the ovation wash over him, though inside he felt the weight of what had just transpired. He had not only saved the concert, he had crossed a line, dared to make music the weapon against silence. The officers did not leave, nor did they advance. They hovered, suspended between authority and paralysis, while the audience screamed themselves hoarse in support of the man on stage. And Elvis, steady beneath the spotlight, knew the night had only grown more dangerous. He had pushed back, but in doing so, he had forced the men in uniform to decide how far they were willing to go. The battle was no longer just about movements of hips or accusations of obscenity. It had become a direct confrontation between a voice raised in hope and the machinery of control. And the machinery, though shaken, was not finished yet. The ovation that followed, If I Can Dream, still thundered when the police drew closer. Their boots tapped against the edge of the stage, not loud enough to drown out the applause, but steady, deliberate. For the audience, it looked like nothing more than officers standing guard. For those closer to the action, the band, Parker, and Elvis himself, it was a warning written in body language. One officer, stocky with cropped hair and a face carved from granite, leaned in toward the nearest promoter. His words were low but sharp, each syllable carrying the weight of authority. After his last song, He Comes With Us, no exceptions. The message traveled fast. The promoter's face drained of color, and he turned instinctively toward the wings where Parker stood. Parker caught the signal, understood at once, and nearly crushed his cigar between his fingers. He muttered curses under his breath, his mind racing. Arrest meant scandal, front-page photos of Presley in cuffs, a circus that could burn contracts, taint reputations, and maybe even collapse the Hilton's entire residency. The news reached Elvis within moments. A member of his entourage, leaning close under the pretense of offering a towel, whispered the words into his ear, "They're taking you after the set." For a flicker of a second, Elvis froze. His eyes darted across the crowd, then to the stern figures in the front rows. His chest tightened. He had been threatened with censorship before, but the thought of being dragged out of the Hilton in handcuffs, before his fans, before the cameras, was a different weight entirely. Yet fear didn't hold him long. Something inside him shifted, the same spark that had carried him from the poverty of Tupelo to the heights of fame. If they wanted submission, they would get the opposite. He stepped to the microphone, a sly grin curling at his lips. The room quieted in anticipation. His voice, warm with humor, rang out. "Well, if I go to jail tonight, I hope they let me bring my guitar." The effect was immediate. The audience erupted in laughter, a wild release after the tension that had gripped them for so long. People clapped, shouted, whistled. Women waved handkerchiefs, men slapped tables in delight. Even some of the band members chuckled nervously, grateful for the break in mood. But then his expression changed. The grin faded, replaced by a solemn intensity. His eyes narrowed slightly, his voice dropping into a steady tone that carried across every corner of the hall. "I've worn a uniform. I've served this country. If my music is a crime, then maybe you need to arrest the whole of America." The laughter dissolved into silence, replaced by a swell of emotion so strong it was almost physical. People gasped. Some covered their mouths, others clutched their hearts. A woman near the front wept openly, the mascara running down her cheeks. Even the officers shifted uncomfortably. For a moment, the granite facade cracked. The stocky officer who had spoken earlier glanced down at his shoes, then back up at Presley with something almost like uncertainty. It was as though the memory of Elvis in uniform, shipped overseas, serving in Germany as a soldier like any other young man, hovered over the room. Undeniable. Elvis didn't let the silence linger too long. He nodded toward the band, who struck up the next song with renewed force. The rhythm pounded, the guitars howled, but the meaning of his words hung in the air heavier than the music. Every fan in that room knew they were witnessing not just a show, but a confrontation where Presley had laid his dignity, his patriotism, and his defiance on the line. The crowd reacted as though they had been set aflame. They screamed louder than they had all night, not just for the music, but for the man who had dared to challenge power with wit and truth. Men who rarely showed emotion stood and clapped until their palms reddened. Women leaned across tables, their eyes shining, mouths open in wonder. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Elvis allowed himself a small breath of relief. He had shifted the energy once more, turned fear into laughter, and then laughter into devotion. But he also knew the game was not over. The officers hadn't retreated. Their plan had not changed. They were waiting, and with each song that passed, the shadow of the arrest loomed closer. Still, Presley pressed forward. He gave the crowd his movements, his voice, his presence, as though daring the police to act. Every thrust of his hips, every sweep of his arms, became a double-edged gesture, entertainment for the fans, provocation for the law. The more he performed, the sharper the edge grew. Backstage, Parker barked into the ears of promoters and Hilton staff, demanding intervention, pleading for compromise, anything to stave off the threat. But even he knew that the final word would not come from him or from a police captain. It would come from the stage, from the man who had turned the evening into a standoff between art and authority. And Elvis, standing tall beneath the blaze of the lights, seemed almost serene. Arrest, scandal, danger. None of it mattered in that moment. He had chosen his side, and it was not silence. The night pressed on, heavy with the knowledge that every lyric, every gesture, might be his last on that stage before the hand of the law reached for him. And yet, he refused to falter. The concert had already moved far beyond the realm of music. Each song felt less like entertainment and more like testimony. every lyric infused with the electricity of confrontation. Elvis could sense it. Every breath from the audience, every furtive glance exchanged between officers near the stage. The Hilton showroom was no longer just a venue. It had become an arena of principle. As the band played another number, Presley's voice rang out strong, but his eyes betrayed his calculation. He scanned the crowd, gauging their mood, sensing their readiness. He saw faces alight with passion, others still frozen in fear, and behind them the shadowed figures of the police, stiff as statues, waiting for their moment. Then, without warning, he cut the band short. The music died mid-beat, the echo of the last chord hanging awkwardly in the air. The sudden silence jolted the audience, their cheers tapering into confusion. Elvis gripped the microphone stand and leaned into it, his voice carrying the weight of something more than performance. "I see men here tonight who want to stop this music. They think love and freedom are dangerous. Do you agree with that?" The crowd erupted, a thunderous "no" rolling through the hall like a wave. It wasn't polite applause or the squeals of adoration. It was a unified rejection, a collective roar that shook the very walls of the Hilton. Presley paused, letting the force of their voices settle, his expression a mixture of solemnity and challenge. He turned his head slowly toward the officers seated at the front. The spotlight caught them, their faces pale, jaws clenched, every eye in the building burning holes through their presence. And then Elvis did something no one expected. He walked toward the edge of the stage, picked up a bottle of water from a small table, and unscrewed the cap with deliberate calm. He descended one step closer to the audience, leaned forward, and extended the bottle toward the officer who had given the signal earlier in the night. "You look thirsty, man," he said evenly, his southern drawl both playful and piercing. "You should relax. We're just singing." The audience gasped. For a moment, the entire showroom felt suspended in midair, the tension unbearable. It was a gesture at once audacious and gentle, a challenge wrapped in kindness. Elvis had not shouted, had not threatened. He had offered water. Yet, the meaning was clear. "You have no power here beyond what we allow." The officer didn't move. His eyes flickered, his jaw tightened, but his hands remained frozen at his sides. To take the bottle would have been surrender. To refuse outright would have risked inflaming the crowd. Instead, he did nothing, an immovable wall, but one that looked strangely fragile under the spotlight. Elvis straightened, lowered the bottle, and returned it to the table. He never broke eye contact with the officer as he did so. The crowd responded with an eruption of cheers and whistles, the tension bursting into raw celebration. People stamped their feet, clapped their hands, screamed his name as though they had witnessed a duel won without a blow. The officer finally turned slightly, giving a small, sharp gesture to his men. It was not retreat, but neither was it advance. The signal was clear. The show would end after the next song. They had drawn their line. Elvis caught it, and so did Parker in the wings. The colonel nearly crushed his cigar, whispering to himself in frustration. He knew what that signal meant. One more song, then the arrest, no matter the crowd's mood. The danger had escalated to its peak, but Elvis looked strangely calm. He turned back to the audience, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. For all the fire in the room, he carried himself with the serenity of a man who knew exactly where he stood. He had faced fame, ridicule, heartbreak, and loneliness. Tonight, he faced power itself, and he did so with a quiet certainty that left the crowd breathless. The audience, too, had transformed. They were no longer passive spectators. They leaned forward in their chairs, gripped one another's hands, shouted in unison when prompted. They had become participants, part of the defense around their idol. The Hilton showroom felt like a fortress, and Presley its heart. The officers bristled under the weight of that unity. For all their authority, they could sense the imbalance. One singer and his fans had created something they could not simply walk over without consequence. Yet their orders stood. Elvis knew what awaited him. He could see it in their stares, in their clenched jaws, in the signal the officer had given. And still he smiled faintly, almost sadly, and leaned once more toward the microphone. "We've got time for one more," he said softly, his voice carrying across the hall. "Let's make it count." The words sent a shiver down the audience. They knew, without needing to be told, that the night was reaching its climax. Whatever happened after the next song, they were standing inside history. And as the band readied themselves, the tension in the Hilton showroom reached its most dangerous height. Authority waiting to strike. The crowd prepared to resist. And Elvis Presley, standing in the light, about to deliver his final, undeniable challenge. The room was on edge, suspended, between thunderous applause and the silence of fear. The officers had made their signal. The colonel knew what it meant, and Elvis himself felt the gravity of the moment pressing down on his chest. One song left. That was the boundary they had drawn. If they expected him to close meekly, to end with something light and forgettable, they had forgotten who he was. Elvis stepped back, adjusted the microphone, and without fanfare gave the cue. The band, already nervous, exchanged quick looks. Some understood immediately. The first notes fell like a declaration, solemn and unmistakable. An American trilogy. The audience gasped, then hushed as though entering a sanctuary. It was not just a song, it was three pieces of America stitched together. The mournful lullaby of enslaved voices, the Southern anthem Dixie, and the soaring battle hymn of the Republic. It was contradiction and unity, pain and triumph, all at once. To choose it here, under the eyes of the police, was an act of pure defiance. Elvis's voice started low, aching, carrying the sorrow of "All my trials, Lord, soon be over." His tone was heavy with weariness, yet rich with compassion. The lights softened, bathing the stage in a golden glow, his white suit shimmering as though he stood outside time itself. In the audience, people bowed their heads, some clasping hands. Others wept silently, the song piercing places too deep for words. A woman near the stage reached for her child, pulling him close as though to say, "Remember this. Remember him." Then came the rise into Dixie, the melody both sweet and defiant. Elvis leaned into it, his voice strong, reclaiming the tune not as a relic of division, but as part of the larger tapestry he was weaving. The crowd stirred. Southerners in the audience shouted in recognition, but no one moved to break the spell. It was as though he had taken something fraught and dangerous and transformed it into unity before their eyes. The officers shifted in their seats. Some crossed their arms tighter. Others avoided the stares of the audience, now focused not on them, but on Presley's defiance. The captain's jaw twitched, yet even he could not escape the pull of the music. The tension was still there, but it now existed within the chords of the song itself, not the fists of men. And then came the final swell, the battle hymn of the Republic. The band rose with him, brass blazing, drums pounding, voices of the backing singers lifting like a choir. Elvis's voice soared above it all. "His truth is marching on." The words crashed through the room like a tidal wave. Fans leapt to their feet, waving handkerchiefs, some holding small American flags they had brought with them, waving them high as tears streamed down their faces. It was no longer a performance. It was a proclamation, a challenge hurled at authority cloaked in patriotism too undeniable to oppose. Even some of the officers faltered. One, younger than the rest, turned his gaze downward, his lips pressed tight as though battling the conflict inside him. Could a man who had served his country in uniform really be accused of treason for singing of its truth? As the last words rang, "Glory, glory, hallelujah," Elvis extended his arms wide, palms open, his figure illuminated against the dark backdrop. For a heartbeat, the room was utterly still. The orchestra's final note lingered in the air, trembling like the last light of sunset before nightfall. Every eye fixed on him, every breath held. The question was unspoken, but unmistakable. Would the police now storm the stage? Would the night end in the clatter of boots and the flash of handcuffs? The officers hesitated. The captain's hand twitched at his side, his decision teetering in the balance. The crowd sensed it, their bodies stiff, their muscles coiled. The slightest move would have unleashed chaos. 2,000 people against a handful of officers, a riot in the heart of Las Vegas. Elvis didn't flinch. He held his stance, arms still wide, as though offering himself to whatever came next. His eyes scanned the crowd once, then fixed on the officers, steady and unwavering. He had delivered his statement not in shouts or threats, but in music. The challenge was on them now. The silence that followed was not emptiness. It was tension stretched so thin it could have snapped with the weight of a breath. Then, from somewhere deep in the showroom, a single clap rang out. Another followed. Within seconds, the room exploded. The ovation was not applause alone. It was fury, loyalty, reverence. People stomped their feet, pounded tables, screamed his name as if daring the officers to try. Elvis let his arms lower, a faint smile flickering at the edge of his lips, though his chest heaved with exhaustion. The song had cost him, drained him, but it had also placed him beyond reach. Whatever the law had threatened, the spirit in that room now belonged to him. The Hilton showroom shook with noise, louder than any police command could ever be. The officers sat frozen, caught between duty and the undeniable truth of what had just unfolded. And as the cheers rolled on, Elvis turned slowly and walked toward the back of the stage. His final challenge had been issued, carved not in defiance alone, but in the anthem of a nation. The night was not over. The decision had not yet been made, but everyone in that room understood. They were standing in the presence of something larger than music, larger than authority. They were standing in the presence of a man who had dared to make his last song a battlefield. The echoes of an American trilogy still reverberated in the Hilton showroom, though the instruments had gone silent. Elvis stood near the center of the stage, his chest heaving, beads of sweat sliding down his temples. His arms had fallen to his sides, but his presence filled the hall as if the song itself still hung around him, suspended in the air like smoke. For a moment, time seemed frozen. Then the captain rose from his chair near the front row. The scrape of his chair legs against the floor was like a blade tearing through silence. He stepped forward, one boot against the low riser of the stage. His hand hovered near his belt, not yet reaching but heavy with implication. The audience gasped collectively, a ripple of dread moving through the room. And then something remarkable happened. A group of fans in the front rows stood, almost instinctively. Then more rows behind them. In seconds, dozens of people stepped forward, moving between the stage and the officers. They did not shout. They did not brandish fists. They simply stood, Arms linked, shoulders squared. A human wall. From the balcony, voices rang out, "Leave him be! He's ours!" More people surged toward the front, not to attack, but to protect. They positioned themselves with quiet defiance, facing the officers with unblinking eyes. Men in suits, women in gowns, teenagers in denim jackets, all united by the same impulse. If you touch him, you'll have to go through us. The officers froze. The captain glanced left and right at his men, who shifted uncertainly under the glare of hundreds of eyes. Their training had not prepared them for this. Not a riot, not violence, but a wall of civilians standing in absolute silence, daring them to act. The weight of the standoff pressed into every corner of the showroom. Glasses trembled on tables. Waiters stood rooted, trays suspended mid-air. The audience that had come for music had transformed into something else entirely. A congregation, a shield, a living verdict against authority. The captain clenched his jaw. His hand twitched once more at his side. He knew he had the law, but he did not have the room. One step forward could ignite a stampede, an uncontrollable fire that would consume not just the show, but the city's reputation, perhaps even his own career. He exhaled sharply through his nose, then gave the faintest nod to his men. Retreat. The officers stepped back, slow and deliberate, their faces masks of stone, though their eyes betrayed unease. The captain lingered for a heartbeat longer, staring up at Elvis as though willing him to falter. But Presley did not move. His gaze was steady, unblinking, calm as stone. Finally, the captain turned on his heel, leading his men toward the back of the hall. The audience erupted. The ovation was no longer mere applause. It was victory. People screamed, clapped, embraced strangers beside them. Some pounded their fists on tables in rhythm, chanting his name. The Hilton showroom shook with a force greater than music. Elvis raised his hand gently, asking for quiet. Slowly, the noise ebbed, though the energy did not fade. His voice, when it came, was low, almost a whisper, yet every person in the hall heard him as if he had spoken directly into their ear. Tonight, you didn't see a singer. You saw freedom. Don't ever forget this. The words hung in the air, intimate yet monumental. For many in the audience, it was as though he had spoken to the deepest part of them, the part that longed for dignity, for expression, for defiance in the face of authority. He gave a final nod, then turned toward the wings. The spotlight followed him only for a moment before dimming, leaving the stage in shadow. He disappeared into the curtain, his white suit vanishing like a vision, while behind him the roar of the crowd swelled again, shaking the walls. But unlike the wild cheers of earlier in the night, this ovation carried something heavier. It was not just adoration. It was gratitude. It was solidarity. It was the sound of people who had been given a glimpse of themselves in the courage of another. Backstage, Parker exhaled, as though he had aged 10 years in an hour. Musicians sat slumped against the walls, drained but exhilarated. Some exchanged wide-eyed looks, realizing they had just played their instruments through history itself. And Elvis, away from the blinding lights at last, leaned against the wall for a moment, his chest still rising and falling. He was exhausted, yet his eyes gleamed with something fierce. He knew he had risked everything, his reputation, his career, even his safety. But he also knew he had given his audience a truth no officer could silence. Out in the showroom, the people still clapped, still shouted, long after he had gone. They would leave with stories that would outlive the neon and the smoke, stories they would tell their children and grandchildren. And though the officers had walked away, though the law had chosen silence for that night, The impact of what had happened could not be undone. The Hilton showroom had become the site of a victory not measured in notes or dollars, but in spirit. Elvis had not been arrested. He had not been silenced. He had walked off the stage not in chains, but in triumph. And as the applause echoed into the night, beyond the Hilton walls, into the neon-lit desert city, and the dark stretches of highway beyond, it carried with it a single truth, that for one night in Las Vegas, music had stood taller than authority, and freedom had worn the face of a man in a white suit who refused to bow.